Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thanks for joining us for this evening's events, which is the latest. I think it's is it the fourth? No, the fifth in a series of events organized by the Critical Humanities program and the
Critical Approaches to Development.
Critical Approaches to Development program and the Center for Arts and Humanities at AUB. And it's the series is entitled Settler Colonialism and the Rise of Fascism. I'm very pleased to welcome tonight's three speakers, who are Sabrina Fernandes, Bruno Huberman, and Greg Burris. I'll introduce each of the three speakers, but I believe that Sabrina and Bruno will be speaking first, and then Greg will follow after. So let me introduce Sabrina Fernandes, who is a Brazilian sociologist and political economist, focused on transition, Latin America, and internationalism. Sabrina is the head of research at the Alameda Institute, which is an international institute for collective research rooted in contemporary social struggles. And her fellow speaker today is Bruno Huberman, who is a professor of international relations at the Pontifical Catholic University of Sao Paulo, Brazil. So please, Sabrina and Bruno, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ray. Let me just check. We have about 20 minutes each, or is it 20 minutes between me and Bruno?
I think it's 20 minutes each, I believe.
Okay, all right. I'll try not to take the whole time, like about 15 minutes or so. So thank you very much. Thanks for the introductions. It's very I've been in conversation with Nadia over this issue in the past, so I think it's very important to have this series of talks and try to strategize and do this from an internationalist perspective, because I fully believe that the situation faced by Palestine over the past decades, but the way it has been catalyzed over the past almost 2 months now, this has a lot to do with the international community. So having the opportunity to speak to you from Brazil, connecting some of the dots of what's going on around not just international relations, but also trade and solidarity. I think this is a way of us trying to move forward on this. So thank you very much. I'm going to speak to you very briefly about some conversations around denormalization as a path or a prerequisite for decolonization. And I think this is, since we're going to be discussing settler colonialism in different aspects of it here, I think it's important to come from the perspective that any conversation that has anything to do with peace, like in between quotes here, when it comes to Palestine, if it does not approach it from a path of decolonization, it's not about peace at all, because it is just rhetorical. It's peace without a project. It is peace in the way that has been captured by international relations agreements, treaties, and accords in the past that in the end have only to do with the normalization of the relationship between other states and Israel, and not considering Palestinians as subjects here. And one of the elements around these conversations around peace is that one of the great successes of Israel in the past 2 decades or so is that any conversation that touches on the subject ends up being completely captured by this imaginary around one state and two state solutions. So rather than discussing processes that actually fight the advancement of settler colonialism in the region, how it affects Palestinians, how it affects other Arab minorities in the region, how this pertains, for example, to the Bedouin communities in the Negev, or it pertains to the Syrians in the occupied Golan, this is completely ignored, because in the end, the same way that we see a conversation today being captured by, well, do you condemn Hamas or not? Or do you condemn Hamas or not when it comes to the actions of October 7th? In general, whenever you try to approach the Israel-Palestine conflict from a perspective that is actually aimed at resolving the problem, usually people think that the safeguard is to talk about a state format. And talking about a state format in a sense that if you really do want peace, or if you are approaching Palestine from a perspective of recognition, it is about recognizing the state of Palestine. It is about recognizing the possibility of two states in the region. This is something that all of those working from a critique of settler colonialism and a critique of these international agreements that have been basically imposed on the Palestinian people and have shown to have failed because of the advancement of settler colonialism, is that the capture of the two-state solution in the conversation is a way for the international community. And when I mean the international community, first and foremost, I'm talking about other states involved in the conversation here, to basically get go ahead, and we're fine, we care about peace in the region because we want to discuss two states. We recognize Palestinians, but not as Palestinians, only as a possibility of a Palestinian state. But what's very interesting here is that this conversation completely lacks knowledge, foundation, and proper debate on sovereignty in the region. So you're discussing a two-state solution that has nothing to do with sovereignty for Palestinians, because it is still about reconciling with the presence of a Zionist state that has settler colonialism as its big project and horizon of expansion in the region. In fact, beyond the territory known as Palestine here. But it rings a bell in the international community as a safeguard that, well, I'm not talking about the elimination of Israel, I'm talking about weighing both sides. So you end up playing to this normalization, even when you're discussing the state here. And what is very interesting is that in the end, the state of Palestine does not work, stays just on paper, or it is something that you can put on in terms of like on a passport. It's a recognition, mostly symbolic, but it has nothing to do with sovereignty. But it leads to the continuous reaffirmation of the sovereignty of the Israeli state in the region. So in the end, what you get from the two-state solution debate and the way it has captured the positions of international leaders, so governments and presidents and diplomats, it's a way of actually helping to normalize the conversation. So the two-state solution, as it has become very prominent today, it is part of the colonial project. It is helping to normalize rather than denormalize. It is helping colonial advancement rather than the perspective of a path for a decolonial future. And understanding here that you cannot have peace in the region without decolonization, without restructuring the terms of conviviality, restructuring the terms of territorial distribution of resources, and actual safety of the people in the region. So by treating peace as something that you can have without a project, the international community has basically found itself in a perspective of like empty calls for solidarity. These empty calls for solidarity coming from the states are obviously very entrenched in previous imperialist interests or commercial interests, and it presents a big challenge for those in the international community. There are non-state actors. So we're talking here about social movements, we're talking about the Palestinian diaspora, we're talking about those standing in solidarity from the perspective of labor unions, political parties, and other actors. And it shows that in the end, when you're trying to challenge the matters of Zionist sovereignty in the region, it is quite hard because we're already all familiar with the way that there's a lot of misinformation and also manipulation and bad faith when it comes to equating any call to denormalize the state of Israel, let alone the end of the state of Israel, as as the end of the Jewish people or as a call for like the elimination or even genocide. We're already familiar with this level of manipulation here. But in a way, this trickles down to some of the issues around strategy, because when we understand that denormalization, it is about fighting this entrenchment of certain institutions that empower the sovereignty of the state of Israel, you have to have a strategy around blockades. And the blockades are very important here, and they come with different types of layers, because they would go after directly what has been called the normalization or peace treaties or peace accords that have involved the state of Israel in the past. So before I get into the certain elements of the blockades here, let's just recall very quickly some elements of the Abraham Accords that happened with Arab states and how they actually they trickle down and they influence the way other states, including Latin America, look at the region. Something that's very interesting about the Abraham Accords is that they do say peace. It's a declaration for peace or a treaty for peace here and there. And this full normalization through peace in the end has to do either with trade, or it has to do with other imperial, sub-imperial interests in the region. In a sense, we could even say that these normalization agreements, they actually help to further colonization in the region, even when it's not about the state of Israel. So something that's quite clear is that when it's mentioned peace here, Palestinians are excluded as a subject. So it's peace between states. So it would be between Israel and Morocco. It would be between Israel and Sudan and the UAE and so on. They completely ignore a previous consensus that was established around the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002, that you would have to wait for Palestine to be the subject of peace here for the other states to join. So that ends up being swept under the rug from now on, and it's not even mentioned, to be quite honest. And it's done in this particular perspective because there are other interests at play. So the fact that the United States brokers many of these agreements, this is not just because they have the power to get people on the table. It's because the other states want something from the US in this process. And my argument here is that it has to do with colonial expansion and trade for the other states as well. I think a paramount example that we have here is Morocco, because part of the negotiation for Morocco to recognize Israel and to sign a normalization agreement with Israel comes with the US recognizing the Western Sahara as a territory of Morocco. So like the sovereignty of Morocco over the Western Sahara, even though the UN and other historical blocs and other collectives of states do not recognize it. So Morocco gets something out of it that also has to do with the subjugation of other people that are going through processes of settler colonialism in the region as well. So you can see how this is not just restricted to the Palestinian territories and Palestinians and other minorities in the region being subjugated by Israel, but how this project actually goes into the other areas as well. And the US helps to broker deals in this way, in the sense of also selling arms to some of these states that were not able to purchase military equipment from the US before, but by signing the normalization agreements with Israel, they have access to it, or they have access to not being considered by the US a state that sponsors terrorism. So these brokered deals here, usually when you come into it in the press, you usually get the impression that the US was basically a bunch of diplomatic attachés that got some people together in a room and said, oh, let's talk. It's really important. And then in the end, we'll sign an agreement. But it was a brokering here is really in the trade colonial sense. It's about what can we get you so you normalize this relationship with Israel. And in the end, you find out that it has nothing to do with peace, especially because in some areas, it is about advancing colonization more directly. But what's very interesting to us here is that it shows that the Israeli state has successfully learned how to bypass the more collective agreements in global society. So all of the UN resolutions that they insist of ignoring, except resolution 181, of course, and they keep doing so because they have other ways to apply leverage here. And so it's about bypassing these larger bodies of governance that are rendered more and more obsolete in the process. I think something that's very like a big evidence of the situation right now is the amount of UN personnel that have been murdered alongside the bombardments and siege and attacks on Gaza right now. Yet the UN keeps normalizing the situation, and a lot of the other states believe that once you get into an agreement for a resolution with the UN Security Council, things will work. And the only problem is maybe that, well, the US vetoed it, as if it was just a matter of a vote or not, and not a matter of political economy, and how there are many other layers of normalization that have happened in the past years that have empowered Israel and the current government to become even lazier around propaganda, or to become more honest about what they're planning on doing. Things that are being said right now, they're not being said just because they're getting sloppier, even though we do have a sense that Israeli propaganda online, it is a little sloppier than in the past, but because they can say things and things will not happen because there are many other layers of agreements and cooperation in place that do not get questioned here. And that these agreements around cooperation or normalization through trade, or because a state is getting something else from the US or the European Union or any other ally, powerful imperialist ally of Israel, it shows that when some of these states are not acting in a more forceful way, pushing for a ceasefire or even pushing for a true path of decolonization here, is because their own interests are also at play here. And this has to be considered. So it's not just about showing solidarity and caring about what happens in the region. It is about these imperial capitalist relations that are also in place in other areas. We have, in the case of Brazil, a progressive government right now that is completely enmeshed in the web of normalization of Israel, because we will not revoke military cooperation agreements that were signed and proposed by the previous government that was a far-right, much more Zionist government, but you won't go that far because there are companies involved here, and there are interests in terms of a repressive system of public security in Brazil as well. The same issues are being raised by the indigenous communities in Chile on why the current progressive government of Chile is not really advancing in the conversations to revoke some of these military cooperation agreements, because the arms and the equipment and the training, they also have to do with the way public security is used to repress and take over territory in Chile. So the interest here cannot be reduced to going alongside the US or going alongside the Zionist project, but we need to be able to bring this to the level of international political economy and how sovereignty is also being approached by these other states. Based on this, and I'm leading into like the last part of what I want to talk to you before we have a more general conversation here. It means that blockade becomes more powerful than ever, in the sense that you can have blockade coming from civil society, coming from social movements, and more politically engaged actors in each country, in a way that solves two problems at once. In the way that, for example, will stop arms being sent from a port to Israel, so they can use it against Palestinians, but also in terms of strengthening the perspectives of a labor union that's refusing to send those arms somewhere else, and starting to challenge where the capital is coming from, what are the interests of the companies involved, and the difference between having public or private control of certain industries in each country. So obviously, when it comes, for example, to fuel, and this is something we are become even more familiar with since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, is that around like energy security, issues around provision of energy domestically, but also outside, when it comes to having a public or a state-owned public utilities company, or even when it comes to fossil fuels, the unions tend to be able to apply more pressure also against the government here, whereas unions in the private sector might be more fragile in that sense, and this would require them to act more in the sense of a historical bloc. The fact that Israel goes through the US and makes these bilateral agreements all of the time that bypass the larger bodies of governance means that on the other side, we should be doing the same. We should be acting as historical blocks rather than arguments that, well, when a state should go and just make a random declaration. Something Bruno and I have been working on. We published a short piece on this, but we're writing a bigger article on this right now, is how you have certain levels of diplomacy here that you can have a shift in narratives. So the fact that, you know, Lula is now saying genocide, he's using certain words, or Macron very recently used the word ceasefire. These shifts in narrative, they do indicate a level of discomfort within these governments in how they position themselves. But the relationships between the states, they're not the same thing as the positions of the governments. And this is important. The state relationships, they're prior, they're more entrenched here. And the fact that Lula might come out and say that he's hoping for peace and that he's working towards peace, or Itamaraty, the Brazilian Foreign Office, is trying to broker something around this, the fact that trade keeps flowing and the commercial interests keep flowing within the military interests in the region shows that, well, the wars don't really have a lot to back them up. They're materially empty in a sense. And that's why we need to understand the challenge right now from going in terms of like physical, military, and diplomatic blockades in the region. The physical can even be like physical very directly the way that I'm mentioning right now. The fact that we had activists going to ports and trying to stop things from being sent, or actually trying to help with the pressure for humanitarian aid and humanitarian support. Physical blockades, they call a lot of attention, but it also can be physical blockades in the sense of how labor unions are very critical to the process of stopping certain flows of capital into Israel, by stopping the flows of merchandise, by stopping the flows of equipment, by actually hurting the interests of certain businesses there. The military aspect of it also comes on the aspect of the weight of an arms embargo here, and how it's really not on the table at all. So calls for a ceasefire that are basically dependent on the Israeli state and its infrastructure actually putting down the arms they have and not using them. They completely ignore the power relationships in the area, whereas it would make much more sense for calls for a ceasefire and should come alongside with an arms embargo. You cannot further fuel the military equipment personnel and strengthening in the region. This is something that when it comes to the European Union, it was discussed, and it was a matter of a lot of contention, including for progressive and leftist parties in the European Union, when it came to states sending support to Zelensky himself. You know, why we're going to provide this much aid in military funds, but also we're going to sell these planes, or we're going to sell certain types of equipment and weapons to Ukraine. These will lead to debate. Yet right now you can see how weak, marginal, almost empty the debate is when it comes to the actual flow of weapons. This all has into Israel. This is only really coming to the forefront when it comes to the fact that like some of the unions are refusing to ship them, and there are activists denouncing that directly with their body. So you can see that the physical and the military, they kind of go together in that sense. But the diplomatic blockade, is something that has to do with normalization, because in the end, physical, military, and diplomatic, all of this is commercial. You cannot have one thing without the other. There are no diplomatic relationships in the world. There are detached from like the commercial interest, or even setting up trade offices. We do know, we're very familiar with the fact that even when certain states don't have full diplomatic relationships, they will have a trade office with trade personnel established in the country. And that has always been one of the entryways that Israel has had with other countries that might not fully recognize it, but will establish some level of relationship with trade. And this could go from any types of commodities, like anything from agriculture to general industrial merchandise, to provision of energy sources, and as well to weapons. So that means that by recognizing this level of blockades, a country by itself won't go much further right now than what we're already seeing in the global south. So Chile, Colombia, they go and they recall the ambassador, and that's a way of showing discomfort. It's a way of showing, well, the relationship should not be the same because you're acting the way that you're acting right now against Palestinians. But the difference between recalling an ambassador and actually expelling this Israeli ambassador is ocean-wide here, because you can just recall an ambassador, and as soon as the situation doesn't look as bad anymore, you can send the ambassador back, and you quickly reestablish relationship. So we do understand this as being something as part of the conversation around denormalization, but it hasn't been enough to move us into an actual denormalization wave of the state of Israel here. And in the fact, like when we talk about Bolivia breaking diplomatic relationships, well, materially, this relationship was not really strong and established from the past, ever since the Evo Morales government, either way. But if we do get into a conversation around arms embargoes and proper sanctions here, so anti-imperialist sanctions in the sense that there are blocks of commercial trade and blocks around weapons and military, academic, and cultural corporations, we get to the final point that there is a reason why conversations around denormalization have been criminalized by Israel, by the US, by the state of France, by the state of Germany in many areas, because they do tend to go into a direction of weakening the capitalist power in the area, and actually breaking all of these agreements that have been established for a really long time. And a lot of the states are just not willing to do that because of their own internal dynamics and their own domestic interests as well. That means that acting as a historical bloc here, so that solidarity does not become empty the way that conversations around peace have become empty throughout the process, is that the solidaristic community that might include even some governments, for example, the president of Colombia, those that have been more outspoken about it, is that there is a necessity here to negotiate from your own region a way of applying pressure by cutting sources, by cutting the flow of capital and cooperation here. This will not be done just by us pressuring the way that we're pressuring here in Brazil for the Lula government to revoke some of these cooperation agreements. But it can be done if we're doing this at the same time that people in Chile are doing that, and people in Colombia are doing that, and more pressure around the Arab states to backtrack on some elements of their accords. Obviously, this becomes harder the more intricate these cooperation agreements are, because they might come depending on each wording of the agreements, they might come with consequences, not just in terms of political backlash or a more trembled relationship with the US and other allies and partners of Israel, but also in terms of like fines when it comes to the commercial deals and other expenses that might be part of the process. Yet it is probably the best bet that we have so that we're not completely captured by these state declarations for the past like 40 days and even more so, saying that they do condemn the displacement of Palestinians in Gaza. They condemn the attacks on hospitals. They condemn the attacks also in the West Bank, and they're hoping for a peaceful solution in the region with 2 states for Palestine and Israel. And the conversation around 1 or 2 state solution is completely pointless right now. This is something that I believe that we need to emphasize. It is making us waste our time and energy, has done so for the past. It is a way of basically capturing us and dragging us into a place that we're never going to escape, because we get into this cycle of condemnation and what do you support, what you don't support, rather than discussing the actual methods for decolonization in the region. So my final argument is that we do have to reject being dragged into the 1 state, 2 state conversation, because this is not about formats. This is about decolonization itself, and decolonization cannot happen in the region if you're not properly challenging the sovereignty of the colonial state. And a way of challenging the sovereignty of the colonial state is by engaging in multiple acts of blockades through historical blocks, because this is precisely the mirror response to what the state of Israel has done with the help of the US in the past years in these normalization agreements, which is about reasserting its own sovereignty by playing to the interests of the other states through blocks, through regional blocks, and bypassing the general and standard levels of global governance through the UN. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Sabrina. So now our next speaker is Bruno Huberman. If please go on. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting us to be here. Thank you, Ray, for introduction, and thank you, Sabrina, to already giving us a great speech on our piece that we published in Africa is a Country that we recommend. We can send you the link. You can read the whole piece. So I'm following Sabrina, trying to give a little bit more aspects on this that we are writing on, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about Latin American decolonization in regards of Palestine. And since we are this panel is also about settler colonialism, gonna be talking about a little bit on this, because one really important aspect here is that Israel will not decolonize itself, of course. And this is the reason that we support Palestine no matter what. And saying this might be, of course, but it's important to understand the radical solidarity that we need to the Palestinians, because in the framework the international community portrays how to be in solidarity with Palestine, you have also to be in solidarity with Israel. Because in this way, you respect the self-determination of the Jews and also the Palestinians. But as Sabrina has already said, being solidarity, respecting the right of existence of Israel is respecting the settler colonial state that's murdering Palestinians. And Israel as a settler colonial state will not decolonize itself. Right? And so we are discussing the really difficult task and the challenges that it's how to understand the colonization of a settler colonial state, right? It's not the same as the colonization of a formal exploitation, colonization, such as Nigeria or in India and others. Just expelling the settlers, right? We're not talking about this situation. We're talking about a reconfiguration of the relations, a reconciliation between Jews and Palestinians in a decolonial fashion, without expelling anyone from the land. And this is a really difficult task. We have, of course, the South African example that Greg might talk more about that after, I don't know, but so in discussing and understanding solidarity between central colonial states, this is what we are discussing, for example, from Brazil, from Latin America, because normally Latin America is seen from different parts of the world, where is this region that we can, where the left are in the government, and solidarity with Palestine is kind of real, but it's a fake solidarity that we, as Sabrina has told us, that it's really hard to grasp was a real solidarity. And we don't have sanctions happening from here. And the more decolonization happens within the state, more solidarity we see with Palestine, such as the case of Bolivia, Cuba, and Venezuela. We can discuss the issues that these three states have, of course. But more recently, for example, Bolivia have different problems with the indigenous communities and sovereignty and recognition. We can discuss many different problems with the decolonization of the Bolivian state, of course. But we have a government in Bolivia that is committed to the decolonization of the state. Somehow we can discuss the limits of it, and this allows, of course, the economic relation between Bolivia and Israel is not that strong, that allows for the Bolivian government to cut the relations without any big consequences. But for example, for the Brazilian state, we are talking about the largest state here in Latin America, the leader of the region, we can talk about it. For example, when Lula recognized Palestine in 2010, every country in South America followed Lula, and many different, I believe every state here in Latin America recognized Palestine as a state in the UN and all of that. But this doesn't mean anything, right? Petro is recognizing Palestine now. I believe Colombia was the last state here in our region that hasn't recognized Palestine. And what Petro, who is the most vocal critique here in our region, leader, of course, that's criticizing what's happening in Gaza and calling it a genocide, but he's not cutting the relation with Israel. He's recognizing Palestine, because the liberal internationalism say that you must do both, because you must recognize Israel is a way to respecting the Jewish self-determination, right? Because in the way that the conversation is set up, we cannot understand another way for the Jews to be free and to have citizenship and respect without having their own ethno-national state, right? Their own racist settler colonial state. So what we are talking about, it's a deep normalization of the settler colonial states in the international community that is the main hegemon in our world is a settler colonial state, the US. And Sabrina said, it was well said, the relation between Morocco and Israel. So, and the same with Brazil. We must understand the relationship between Brazil and Israel. And although we have a leftist government, we can discuss the limits that Lula himself has and how he sees a foreign policy for Brazil. But Brazil is a settler colonial state. Right now in Brazil, we have a deep discussion about the efforts that Brazil is doing to continuing expropriate indigenous land, right? In the Supreme Court, in the Congress, there's a huge debate about that, because the Brazilian society, the Brazilian state, is a deep settler colonial state. Also Chile. We have Boric, who is a leftist. We can discuss the problems with Boric, his foreign policy, but Chile is a settler colonial state. He's expropriating Mapuche lands, of course. And here in Brazil, we have the military who has deep connection with Israel. And this is a really important aspect of the relationship between the countries, because the settler colonial framework between Brazil and Israel allow for the military of these countries to have a really cozy relationship, we can say. And this is the importance of the arms diplomacy of Israel that here in Latin America has one of the largest connections in the world, although it has leftist governments, because Israel is really good in connecting with the other state organizations and bypassing the government in power. And this is what happened here in Brazil. It was during Lula's administration that Israel and Brazil got really close, and Brazil opened its market for the Israeli arms. And Elbit and other really large Israeli military companies have deep connection here, direct with the military. So the government cannot cut directly the connections. And here in Brazil, for example, we have a really deep problem between the government, the leftist government, and the military, because the military supported Bolsonaro. The military is a fascist part of the state, right? And Lula is not willing to confront the military because of international issues here, internal issues here we have. And so these are really, this is how the Israeli state kind of act internationally, because it finds support in fascist parts, in settler colonial parts of the states, although you might have a leftist government, a government that's committed to decolonization or something like that, right? And so this is a really difficult task for the leftists to confront. For example, if we want a military embargo here. A military embargo here in Brazil involves we confront our own military, right? Because to cut the relations between our military and Israel's military, and it means contributing for the decolonization of Brazil, because our military is really, it was one of the largest responsible state actors for expanding in settler colonialism here in Brazil. For example, during the military dictatorship during the 60s and the 70s, the military, was responsible for this settlement project in the Amazon. Since then, they supported settler colonialism, settler colonial expansion in the Amazon because the settler colonial settlement in the Amazon is portrayed as defense, right? The Amazon, because the imperialist interests in the Amazon, and this kind of thing. So, what I'm trying to argue here is the connections between settler colonialism and also the colonization of settler colonial states, and both must go hand in hand. And it's really hard to build this real solidarity and to go beyond liberal internationalism, because the international world order is built by the settler colonial states and the deep normalization of settler colonial states. And one of the argument that we are building here, right, is to go beyond the one state, two state framework. It's to go beyond the liberal internationalism, because liberal internationalism will not allow decolonization to happen through liberal internationalism, through the UN, through all this kind of stuff, because these actors are settler colonial actors. They are imperial actors. And so this is the importance of the Palestinian issue in the end. It means discussing the decolonization of the world order, such as happening during the Cold War, right? during the Cold War, the UN was kind of seen as a space where third world countries can try to push the agenda for decolonization, new economic international order, this kind of stuff. But it failed, right? And this is the importance of building a real solidarity and real alliances based on sanctions. And this is one of the cases that we are defending in our piece and pushing forward, because the colonization, at the same time that settler colonialism expanded all over the world from Europe and supported each other, the colonization must be a world struggle at the same time. This is the conclusion of our piece, and this is the support that Palestinians and, for example, here in Brazil, the people who live in favelas are really supportive of the Palestinian struggle, and they're supporting a military embargo, and because the arms that kill Palestinians are killing people, black people, brown people here in Brazil. And the same we can see with the Mapuche in Chile and other places around the world. And so I believe the settler colonial frameworks is a really important framework to understand not only the actions of the Israeli state in the Palestinian territory, but also its international relations with other countries around the world, and to understand how the international order is built and how it functions to protect these states. And I believe this is my main contribution to the debate, because I believe Sabrina has already said everything that we wanted to say. But thank you, Ray. I'm done, right?
Hey, thanks, Bruno. Thanks very much. Okay, so I'm pleased. So our third and final speaker this evening is Greg Burris. Greg is currently Associate Professor of Media Studies at the American University of Beirut, and also currently a Fellow at the Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Study in South Africa. Greg?
Yes.
Please go ahead, please. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Ray. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, comrades, for coming to hear this talk. Like all of you, I've been completely glued to the news over the last almost 2 months now. And one of the things I've found interesting is like the memes that go around and the different statuses and the things that kind of go viral, at least inside my spheres. And a few weeks ago, I noticed a line going around on Facebook. A lot of my friends were posting. They're just resharing it. And the line was this: "Don't forget to turn your clocks back to 1938 Germany time this weekend." Now, all of my pro-Palestine friends that were sharing this status were, just making the criticism that we're still living in fascist times. And as you say, this series of talks, there is something called the return of fascism. But what's interesting is if you followed that thread and found out who originally posted this line, it was some guy with an Israeli flag as his profile picture. He was saying the same thing. He was saying, don't forget to turn your clocks back to 1938 Germany time, as some criticism that we're living in anti-Semitic times. The fact that this line could work for both sides, I think, kind of indicates that there is some truth here to the idea that we are at a moment where we seem to be stuck in time, that some of the ghosts from the past aren't actually ghosts. They're still alive and well and murdering people. And that's fascism. That's the European radical right of the 20s and 30s. So today I want to concentrate on that last phrase from the series title, Return of Fascism. And ultimately my argument is, if we are seeing if fascism was forced to go underground following World War II in many countries, in Israel it never did. It's been gaining in strength all these past 75 years. Fascism never went anywhere. In fact, it's completely crucial to understanding the Zionist project. So I got 4 points I want to talk about today. I'll just tell you what the 4 points are, and then one by one, I'll do all 4 of them. Point number 1, Zionism is deeply connected to the European radical right of the 20s and 30s. Point number two, the year 1936, not 48, but the year 1936 is absolutely crucial in understanding the trajectory of both Palestinian resistance and Zionism. Point three, following 1936, Zionists unleashed a wave of terror, and one that's still to this day, I don't think, properly understood. And number four, Zionist fascism is still alive and well today, and I'll spend the last part of my talk just drawing the connections and showing how all this prehistory I'm talking about is very, very active today in the state of Israel. So number one, Zionism is deeply connected to European fascism. In the popular imagination, I think, apart from Theodor Herzl, the one person who is most often treated as synonymous with Israel and Zionism is David Ben-Gurion. David Ben-Gurion was extremely active in labor Zionism for two or three decades before the founding of the state of Israel, and he dominated Israeli politics for the first 2 decades of its existence. But I think this is really, if this had some truth 30, 40 years ago, I think that truth is, with each year that passes, each day that passes, that truth is becoming less and less true. David Ben-Gurion's Israel, it might have seemed to be a dominant trend in Israel, but with each passing year, it becomes more and more of a footnote and an anomaly. The person I think whose spirit really explains Israel today is not Ben-Gurion, but his rival, Vladimir Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was a very strange and interesting man. He was born in Odessa, multilingual, very cosmopolitan. He was a soldier. He was a playwright. He was a novelist. He spent most of his time touring Europe and North America, raising funds for revisionist Zionism. And revisionist Zionism is nothing more than fascist Zionism, or at least we should say the Zionism that functioned in the European radical right like a duck in water. I mean, their basic idea was a blood and soil ideology. Judaism or Jewishness within revisionist Zionism was less a religion, and it was explicitly a race. And amongst the Zionists, it's the revisionists who demanded the most maximum large Greater Israel territorial gains of them all. When you look around Europe at that time, the amount of borrowing and the amount of similarity between the revisionist thought and the ideologies of Mussolini and even Hitler are actually quite staggering. Like any good fascist movement, Jabotinsky started a youth movement called Betar. You might recognize the name because it's still around today. There's an incredibly racist soccer team and football team in Jerusalem called Betar. It started as the sports club of a Betar branch in Jerusalem, and so they still carry that name today. But this was a fascist youth movement that had branches throughout Europe. It's interesting to see. It's very interesting to see how actually in some ways Jabotinsky was continuously pushed to the right by the youth underneath him. Like, he would try to continue to have lip service to democracy and liberalism and even the British Empire, but the people underneath him, the youth movement, Betar, was openly fascist. In their newspaper, there was a regular column called Diary of a Fascist. When Nazism first took over Germany, there was a column saying this was a genuine liberation movement for Germany. One of these Betar activists, Abba Achimer, he's the person who wrote Diary of a Fascist. He formed a party in the early 30s called Brit HaBiryonim, which means Alliance of Hooligans or Alliance of Strongmen. It was an openly fascist party in Palestine in the early 30s. Some Betar units even trained in fascist Italy, and they had communications with Mussolini. Mussolini, by the way, called himself a Zionist and supported the Zionist idea of creating a race that would settle Palestine. So with Jabotinsky and Betar and the revisionist Zionism, you have not just flirtations with fascism, but in some cases, open fascism, blood and soil ideology with Jewish and Hebrew names as opposed to Aryan names, but not much different. And violence was crucial. Most of the violence was rhetorical at this point. In Palestine, there was an official policy of Havlagah, or self-restraint amongst the Zionist organizations. They were basically content to let the British deal with Palestinian unrest, and they just concentrated on defending their settlements. And so the mood was not right for open violence against either the Palestinians or the British until 1936. That brings me to my second point. 1936 is the key year to understanding all of this. I think so often we go to the Nakba, 1948, and that we use that as like the main historical year to understand what's taking place in Palestine and the ethnic cleansing. But we can't understand 48 without 36. In April of 1936, Palestinians launched what turned into a 6-month general strike. And that 6-month general strike turned into a 3-year anti-colonial rebellion, one of the greatest anti-colonial rebellions of the entire 20th century. Now, this was very important for several reasons. First of all, it was brutally suppressed by the British. In fact, some of the questions that later Palestinians would have, why didn't the Palestinians successfully fight off the Nakba? It's because they had already expended all their energies in 1936. People were killed, locked up, and all the guns confiscated. So as a result of the rebellion of 1936 and the British suppression of that rebellion, it left the Palestinians in a place where they were unable to successfully defend themselves against the Nakba. But it's also important because this is where the Zionists started to get training. Like at this time, the British actually allowed the Zionist Jews to form police units and special units to help police the Palestinians. One of these was, there's this crazy, I don't know if you've heard of this guy, there's this crazy British soldier named Ord Wingate. He was a Christian fundamentalist. He was very bizarre. He would like eat raw onions and he would meet people in his tent completely naked. And he's a Christian fundamentalist. He trained these Zionist soldiers and taught them things like collective punishment of Palestinians. One of his proteges, by the way, was Moshe Dayan, the eye-patched Israeli general. So at 1936, A, Palestinians get suppressed, but B, Zionist Jews get training with the British troops to police them. And then the third thing that's important about 1936 is, just like October 7, there's all these plans for violence, and October 7 can be used by the Israelis to justify continued ethnic cleansing. The same thing happened in 36. Like I said, all these fascist groups, they wanted violence, but they needed an excuse to be able to unleash it, and 36 provided that excuse. The old policy of havlaga, or self-restraint, gradually got thrown in the toilet, and the Zionists began to practice open terrorism on the Palestinians. That brings me to my third point. Following 1936, Zionists unleashed a wave of terror. There's a couple of incidents that are widely known. The King David Hotel bombing, which took, I think, around 100 people's lives, mostly Palestinians. And then the Deir Yassin massacre in 1948. But those are just two of so many terrorist attacks that were launched against Palestinians and against British during this time period. I don't think it's widely recognized just how severely these Zionist gangs and terrorist groups turned Palestine into a vortex of violence. There were three main groups. The Haganah was the main force. It was under the direction of David Ben-Gurion, but it had about 20,000 soldiers, and it became the primary ethnic cleansing force as we approached 48. But the other two groups were active. They didn't even pretend to be just like a normal military. They were open terrorist groups. One was the Irgun, and the other was called the Lehi. Now, the Irgun had a few thousand troops at their best. They were started by Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was the symbolic supreme commander of the Irgun. This eventually became the group which is synonymous with Menachem Begin, who eventually became Prime Minister of Israel. They put bombs all over the country, synchronized bombs, syncopated bombs, blew up cinemas, cafes, hotels, oil refineries. It was quite extensive. The other group is the Lehi, also known as the Stern Gang. This is a splinter group from the Irgun. These guys were fanatics, like wild-eyed fanatics. They had three primary goals. One was they wanted Greater Israel from the Nile to the Euphrates. They wanted a population transfer to get rid of all the Arabs, all the Palestinians. And third, they wanted to rebuild the Third Temple. They actually, because they were so small, perhaps, they did less like violent action as the Irgun. Like the Irgun did all the bombs, and Leahy group did all the assassinations, even assassinating Britain's #1 diplomat in the region, Lord Moyne in Cairo. They also assassinated Folk Bernadotte. He was a Nazi era hero. He was a Swede who had successfully negotiated the release of thousands of prisoners from Nazi death camps, including thousands of Jews. The UN sent him to Palestine in 1948, and his idea was that all Palestinians who left in the Nakba must be allowed to return. All refugees have the right to return. And so a Leahy hit squad met him in front of his house in Jerusalem and shot him in cold blood. The person who greenlit this assassination was Yitzhak Shamir, the man who later became prime minister of Israel in the 80s. So you have these three groups, and they unleash, like I said, they just unleashed terror from 1936 to 48. There's so many different, like, it wasn't even just in Palestine. The level of their terrorism is, they went far abroad from Palestine. I mean, they blew up two hotels in Vienna, a train in Hanover. They blew up an embassy in Rome. And this is a crazy one. The Leahy managed to recruit one of the philosophy students in Paris of Jean-Paul Sartre. And he successfully smuggled bombs into London and blew up an officers' club. This person, this student of Sartre, is a philosophy professor named Robert Mizrahi. And he's still alive, and he's retired from the Sorbonne today. He was an ethics philosopher. We've had some discussions at AUB about ethics lately. I think this is another kind of ethics philosopher whose ethics I sincerely question. So, I mean, it's just the level of terrorism I don't think is always recognized. For instance, one account that really struck me is the Rex Cinema. The Rex Cinema in the late 30s was one of the primary places in the Palestinian social scene in Jerusalem. It was Palestinian-owned cinema. If you read Edward Said's autobiography, Out of Place, I think it's called, he mentions one time he went to a Jewish cinema and his aunt scolded him, "Why don't you go to the Rex? Give your money to the Arabs," So the Rex was a very, very prominent place in the social scene. With the Irgun completely destroyed it. A hit team went into the cinema. They planted some bombs underneath the seats, and they were timed so that right when the MGM Lion had its third roar, the bombs exploded. There were other Irgun members in the elevated box seats that had hidden bombs in boxes of chocolate, and they were throwing the bombs onto the audience. And as the audience ran out the cinema, there were more Irgun members waiting outside with machine guns. They killed, I think, 13 Palestinians, a few Brits, and they killed a young Jewish couple, a boy and a girl. In the Irgun propaganda, they said the Jewish couple had it coming. They should have known better than to hang out at an Arab establishment. So just the level of terrorism that was unleashed is something that I don't think is often fully recognized, not even by anti-Zionists. Okay, so that's just a bit of that history, but let me conclude. I want to talk about today and how I think this period I've been discussing brings us into the present. I mean, there hasn't, if as I said earlier, if in other countries the violence and the fascism had to go underground and is now coming back up, in Israel it never went underground. It's just been gradually increasing. Now, labor Zionism, as I said, Dave Ben-Gurion, he hated these people. He had a rivalry with Vladimir Jabotinsky and with Menachem Begin. He called Vladimir Jabotinsky Vladimir Hitler, and he actually refused to bring his remains to Israel. When Jabotinsky died in 1940, on his will, he said he wants his remains to go to the state of Israel, and Ben-Gurion refused. They didn't bring those remains over until after Ben-Gurion was no longer the premier. So Ben-Gurion didn't like these folks, and he shut them out of all of his governments. Menachem Begin, the leader of the Irgun, created a group called Cherut. For Arabic speakers, that's related to the word Hurriya. Cherut is just the Hebrew word for freedom. And so Cherut eventually became the Likud party, the party that we now know with Benjamin Netanyahu. So you can see, like, this terrorist group became a party which eventually became the Likud party and is still in power today. If in the past Israel was dominated by labor, today it's dominated by the Irgun. It's dominated by revisionist Zionism. As I said, Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir both became prime ministers. Netanyahu's father was the personal secretary of Vladimir Jabotinsky. So there's even a familiar link to the revisionists through Netanyahu's father. But let's take a look at some of the other monsters that I see in the news these days. Itamar Ben-Gvir, to use that Hebrew R, Gvir. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, he's from a group called the Jewish Power Party. It was founded by the son of the chief ideologue of the Lehi, the guy who was talking about getting the third temple, and the guy who was greenlighting the assassination of Count Bernadotte. So Itamar Ben-Gvir is from a party that is directly descendant of the Lehi. Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, earlier this year spoke in Paris, and in front of him on the podium was a map of Greater Israel, from the Sinai all the way to the Euphrates. It's the same symbol that was previously used by the Irgun. This is an interesting one. Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, who's been on TV talking about how all Gazans are animals. His father served in the 1948 Nakba, the operations. There's an operation called Operation Yoav. This is the operation which swept across the desert and pushed so many refugees into Gaza. Operation Yoav. It was such an important moment in this man's life, he named his son after it. And so currently the defense minister is Yoav Gallant, named after the ethnic cleansing operation that took Palestinians to Gaza, and now he's simply finishing the job that his father started. And then just last month, after October 7, Israel began calling all of his reservists to serve in the armed forces. One of these reservists, you may have seen the news reported on, I think, Middle East Eye, was a 95-year-old veteran who dons his uniform once again to serve as a motivational speaker. His name is Ezra Yachin, and he was a Lehi member. He participated in the Deir Yassin massacre in 1948. As motivational speaker, there's a video of him going from battalion to battalion, yelling commands at the young Israeli troops, saying things like this: erase them, their families, mothers, and children. These animals can no longer live. Every Jew with a weapon should go out and kill them. If you have an Arab neighbor, don't wait. Go to his home and shoot him. So, the ghosts of Deir Yassin aren't ghosts. They're still alive, and they're still breathing, and they're still trying to murder Palestinians. Like, this fascist period and all the violence that came with it is not an exception and not an anomaly. It may have seemed exceptional. It wasn't the majority party in Israel in the early days, but it is now. So the fascism of that period is still very, very much alive and well. We are still fighting against the Nazis that inspired revisionist Zionism 75 years ago. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thanks, Greg. Okay, I think, well, we have at least, 15 minutes for discussion. So please, if anyone has a question or a comment, please go ahead. Okay, well, while people are thinking, maybe I'll just, say something just to kind of kickstart a discussion. And I guess, this is the question to all three speakers. So Sabrina and Bruno were making the case for the, that decolonization must be a world struggle, and it cannot simply be confined to the level of diplomatic blockades. It must include, economic blockade, and that what impedes this is the often the settler colonial history of many, major nation states right now. So in other words, that however much one may denounce, the actions of Israel, at a rhetorical level, there's still this kind of fundamental economic, complicity, which overrides all kind of ideological posturing. And how do you see this claim connecting to kind of Greg's? Like, and Greg was stressing the kind of the openly fascistic ideology that predominates in the current Israeli government, but as Greg was stressing, this is not an anomaly. In other words, this is not some kind of aberration. It's not some kind of peculiar kind of, you know, deviation from a kind of benign kind of, you know, liberal Zionist ethos, but actually it's simply a kind of a reassertion of the fascistic core of revisionist Zionism. Okay, so I guess the question is about, you know, to what extent revisionist Zionism is a break with Orthodox Zionism, if, you know, if there is such a thing. So on one level, you've got so I mean, do you think? So I mean, in a way, it's easy to. I mean, yeah. I mean, how are these things? There's is the economic complicity a major factor impeding the explicit, you know, recognition and denunciation of the fascistic nature of Israel's, you know, genocidal operation in Gaza? Is this? Do you think that also explains the kind of the weird rhetorical kind of dances about whether or not this, about we mustn't use the word genocide. We must be careful to kind of, you know, there's already, you know, as Sabrina was pointing out, already kind of calling for a ceasefire is already kind of seems to be a kind of rhetorical advance. But still there seems to be this weird reticence about, you know, naming, you know, what is actually going on, which it seems would not be the case in any other instance. Like if someone was massacring civilians at the rate at which Israel has been doing for the past, you know, 6 weeks, it seems that there wouldn't be any kind of debate about whether or not this is genocide. So I'm just interested in your thoughts about this, basically. How you know, your papers connect, how the you know the significance, decolonization as involving a necessary economic factor, a recognition of the global economic ties that tie these nation states together, regardless of their diplomatic posturing, on the one hand, and the weird, the silence about the openly fascistic declarations of the current Israeli government.
Well, I guess I can try to speak a little bit to this. I would just say, I noticed that whenever we speak about the differences between different political parties in Israel, if I'm in a pro-Palestine crowd, or if I'm in Lebanon, there's almost an allergy to making those distinctions. There's almost like the assumption if you're making distinctions, you're saying one's good and one's bad. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the West, there's a very different tendency, which is the one I'm really fighting against, the idea that there's like this peaceful, it never was peaceful, but there's this imagined peaceful labor Zionism, and that all this fascist stuff is just like these nut jobs. And so that's what I'm really trying to do. I'm trying to know the nut jobs, that's become status quo. Like, first of all, labor Zionism was also bloody. But second of all, the fascists, the lunatics have taken over the asylum, and they've done so since the 70s. And so we have to think about Israel primarily in those fascistic terms. As to that first group I mentioned, though, like I'm sorry, I think I got away from your question a little bit, but it's just to complete my thought. In terms of making distinctions between different parties and different actors, I don't think this isn't a question of who's good or who's bad. It's just a question of trying to understand. At the end of the day, they're all settler colonialists. And that's also what makes, I think, Israel unique in some ways. If you go back and look at some of the radical Black theorists, W.B. Du Bois, George Padmore, Jaime Césaire, C.L.R. James, writing in the first half of the 20th century, they made the claim that fascism was simply colonialism returning home and being exercised on the home population. So a case like Israel is both. It's a settler colonialist colony, but it's also, it's taking place there. This difference between like labor Zionism and fascist Zionism is not so black and white. They're all connected settler colonialism, and that's what's so dangerous about it. Even the so-called good, labor Zionists are part of that bloodthirsty settler colonialist project, and can very, very easily turn into fascists. I'm sorry, I think I got completely away from your question. My apologies.
Oh, no, it's I think it's connected to what I was asking about.
I can try to talk a little bit about it. I find it interesting, the connections between settler colonialism and fascism. I don't know if it's I'm not really a specialist on fascism, and I find it interesting to understand how it survives during all these years, and how Greg puts it. But the connections exist, right? Césaire said in his book, right, that before Hitler there was other Hitlers in Africa, in the colonial frontiers, but what is interesting about the settler colonial violence, because the settler colonial violence, there is a specificity to it, right? Because it directs towards the indigenous populations, and in a matter of conquering land. And I believe this is a really important aspect, and because we need to understand the specificity of the settler colonial violence and the fascist violence, and to think how they both can relate and how they both can connect. Because I agree, I'm not a specialist on this contemporary discussion of Kasmud, right, far right, extreme right, fascist. I cannot dwell in this discussion, but for me, what's interesting for the cases of Brazil also, and the case of Israel-Palestine, is that there's the settler colonial structure. And no matter what, the left or the right, both are settler colonial, and both are pushing forward for settler colonial expansion and indigenous expropriation, right? You both, for example, right now in Brazil, I mentioned this discussion on expanding indigenous land expropriation. And this is happening under Lula's government, but this couldn't happen under Bolsonaro government. This is really interesting, right? Because it's the struggles between the far right and the left inside the government and inside the state. And because Lula pushed a settler colonial agenda through development, and we need to build this dam but the expulsion of the indigenous people and the Ribeirinhos, that other populations. It's a tragedy, but it's through this new developmental discussion, right? But Bolsonaro is more open. But fascism, the similar discussion we might have between Netanyahu and the labor Zionists in Israel. So I believe the settler colonial violence, it's over there, although it doesn't matter if it's a leftist or a right government. The state is the problem, right? And we need to decolonize the state. And this is the issue when we discuss around here in Brazil, for example. Always when I'm saying we need to decolonize Israel and restructure the state, build a new state, and people say, oh, what about Brazil? We want to expel the white Brazilians. No, I don't want to expel the white Brazilians. I'm here, I'm a settler also. But we need to destroy Brazil also. And I'm supportive of this goal to restructure the Brazilian state, to decolonize the Brazilian state. This is what we are discussing. And for me, it's interesting how to think about this fascist, Bolsonaro and Netanyahu or Ben-Gvir or whatever, whoever, and how does it plays in confronting this decolonization? Because the left is also a problem in this, in the both countries, right? Now, Sabrina wants to add something.
Yeah, maybe we can do a little exercise here because I think might be interesting. So Brazil was under the government of Bolsonaro until last year, who was very actively pro-Israel. So it's very common for you to go to the far-right rallies in Brazil. You find people with a Brazilian flag and an Israeli flag. They will go hand in hand. The Bolsonaro, from the beginning, he was following along the Trump line, saying that he was going to move Brazil's embassy to Jerusalem, the Israeli embassy to Jerusalem, very much showing to the world that he was in cooperation, very aligned with Netanyahu. So in the sense, like the far right in Israel and the far right in Brazil, very aligned. Symbolically, I think there's a big difference between the way that Bolsonaro behaved in alliance with Israel and the way Lula is behaving right now. In fact, I think that would also make a difference in the way that we as Brazilians acting solidarity with Palestine are able to say things right now or not. So there are certain elements, both in the diplomatic line and in the symbolic side around the narratives that do change a lot. Yet the military cooperation is the same. So I think like one of the concerns that Bruno and I have shown in the past, it showed that you may have ideological lines that are different in each country when it comes to, you know, not going towards war, not being directly repressive and things like that. But the main maintenance of the settler colonial capitalist state does show a lot of affinities between the Israeli state and these other states, independent of the government. So the fact that the leftist governments in Latin America tend to be a little lenient towards the Israeli state because it does help with their own interests, I think this is a point of concern. And the fact that in Colombia, this is different because, well, it's the first time Colombia actually has a leftist president, so Petro is having to make things along as he goes. There is a level of recognition that the internal violence in Colombia, the fact that the peace accords keep failing inside of Colombia, has to do with CIA training and the presence of the IDF and Israeli cooperation in the region. So that kind of recognition kind of makes Colombia step aside. But there's something very interesting on the other side too. It's the fact that in Chile, even the Pinochetista, the more far-right parties and organizations, they're pro-Palestinian. So you have like this inversion of values, which is quite odd and very specific to Chile, because in Chile, you have the largest Palestinian diaspora outside of the Middle East. And many of these Palestinians supported Pinochet because of a neoliberal ideological standpoint. So then again, we come back to capital, we come back to the capitalist alliances moving beyond the symbolic or the more direct ideological affinity. This is why I think it's important for us to understand where you have very strong cooperation between the fascists and the proto-fascists. And I think that helps you understand some of the narratives and the more direct alliances that we've had with the far-right governments in Latin America and the Israeli Zionists and the extremist Zionists in a general sense. But the capitalist interests, they blur these ideological lines when it comes to colonization. It does, because it is helping to reinforce some of the internal structures. So we've come to a point that in Chile, one of the big parliamentarians from UDI, which is, you know, like a conservative right-wing party, very pro-Pinochet, that's trying to impose a new constitution now in December that's even worse than the Pinochet constitution, going and saying that he's completely on the side of Palestine and the state of Chile has to be on the side of Palestine. And when Jose Antonio Cast, who was the presidential candidate who lost to Burris last time, starts saying things in favor of Israel, the other far-right people say you can't do that. We're pro-Palestine here. Because you have within the political economic structure of Palestinian solidarity inside of Chile, many different capitalist interests that create a fracture within these parties. But in the end, the Chilean state, whether it is in the hands of the Pinochetistas or the progressives, still refusing to break with these military cooperation ties because the interests of the state go beyond some of these lines. So you find a lot of these contradictions. They're easier to explain and navigate when we're looking around the affinities, like the domestic to the international affinities. We might argue that when it comes to Chile, a lot of the things like coming from the Burris foreign affairs positions, they're kind of counterproductive, or they go against the Chilean self-interest when Burris is going alongside the US and Canada when it comes to other Latin American powers. That's a big problem right there. But when they're still refusing to break with these ties, it has to do with the fact that independent of Burris, Chile is still a settler colonial state, and the solidarity for Palestine may even go beyond the lines of the traditional left, but in the end it's more symbolic, and it's not really going after the things that would break the ties of normalization here. And that really shows like the colonization is still a problem for the left, for the progressives, in terms of not challenging the basis of the colonial state. Ray, I think you're on mute.
Thanks very much. That was very, very illuminating. Any other comments or questions? Please feel free. You can also type a question in the chat if you prefer, and I can read it.
Yeah. Can I say something? Yeah, thanks all for this. Yeah, I mean, I guess my question is really about, again, to push further this discussion of kind of strategy, I suppose, Sabrina, this kind of, so that the idea that is being proposed is that, I mean, it's a question, I mean, in the sense that the anti-colonial struggle is inseparable from the anti-capitalist struggle, right? And when we take this kind of framework, but I think that there's, again, I bring it up because we had a number of kind of Palestinian speakers on a panel a couple of weeks ago, and this is also something that it's not a unified position even within the Palestinian context itself, right? Whether the framework of settler colonization, in fact, is the primary framework, whether the right of return is more primary to the fight against capital. I mean, even within the Palestinian resistance, there's a whole, I mean, obviously there's a whole, there's a range of positions. And there are some people who do feel that the settler colonial framework enforces a kind of a trajectory for struggle that, I don't know, perhaps they see kind of forgoes the importance of the right of return, the kind of in relation. So I mean, I guess the question here is strategy and tactic relevant here in terms of, which can one do struggle against the settler colonial state without necessarily, because there are also bad positions that end up saying, we need to get rid of capitalism to get rid of the settler colonial state from the start, right? So that's like a kind of a struggle that's how do you say that? That's the end in sight, but then how does that really, I guess it's a question about, politics in terms of strategy and tactic. Like, how does one work around these questions, or how do you think about them, I guess, or how are you guys thinking about them? And obviously you're making a very strong point about decolonization, but yeah, I mean, any further comments on this? I don't know.
Yeah, maybe if I can go ahead first and then others can join. Well, we definitely can't wait for the end of capitalism to free Palestine, right? So it's the same thing. You can't wait for the end of capitalism to fix climate change, because the end of capitalism will also be the end of the planet if we don't fix climate change beforehand, right? So we have this the same old question around strategy on reform and revolution, but that also applies to matters of emergency, right? And trying to have strategic maneuvers that fix a couple things, or at least help with a couple things at the same time, even though one might not be completely fulfilled before the other. I think it's a way of us trying to filter through processes. The general sense that I have is that you will not have, like, coming from the standpoint of solidarity, so like speaking as a non-Palestinian, but engaged from the side from Latin American solidarity here. What we can do is, first of all, we understand the international community has been complicit in this process from the beginning, because it dates back to the establishment of the state, or as shown by Greg, like this lenience towards Zionist action that was already building the path for the establishment of a sovereign state from beforehand. So understanding the complicity here is really important for us to understand that solidarity is not optional. It is really part of the process of taking responsibility for it. There's the majority of the world, and talking about like the bigger economies here, I'm not going to put everyone on the same plate, but the big economies, they're liable for what happens in Palestine, not just now, what has happened throughout the process. But even the global south, where there's not so much liability in the same proportion as the US, for example, but there is liability because of these like agreements and points and relationships of cooperation. It means that when we're doing solidarity, we need to understand that we won't be very good at fighting colonialism abroad if we're not also fighting colonialism at home. So building this bridge is really powerful in the sense that it does help to challenge the flows more easily. A lot of people here will be saying, wow, but like so many bad things happen in Brazil. Why do you care so much about what's happening on the other side of the world? Well, because it's directly connected to what's happening here as well. So like when Bruno can talk a little bit more about that, because he contributed to this conversation in Al Jazeera about like the Brazilian favelas and so on. But in a sense, I believe that it's not like one before the other, but trying to find like these specific points of concern here, because fighting the military cooperation in Chile or in Brazil or in Colombia is also a way of strengthening communities at home. And in that way, when you're thinking about the connection, right of return can't be just a principle. It's not a conversation about a principle, so that people can return. We do understand the majority of them won't return. People have made their lives in other places. They'd like to be able to visit. They like to be able to have the connection. And the beautiful thing about having a right is that you don't need to exercise it directly in practice, but you should have it, right? But it's not just a principle in the sense, because it is about territory. The recognition of the right of return is recognizing that territory was taken. And it's the same thing as understanding that if we're talking about settler colonial society, like Brazil or like Chile, we're emphasizing those because we both work mostly in these countries. These are settler colonial societies that recognizing territory doesn't mean that we're going to displace further people from the cities because this was original territory, for example, Tupinambá or something like that. It is about understanding that these processes need to change. You need to put an end to it. So the right of return is directly connected to ending the expansion of settler colonialism, because it shows that the stolen land is the norm, So it's not a new process. It's not something else. It's not annexation post Oslo Accords. It is something that is ongoing. And if it is something that is ongoing, it dates back to us acknowledging the state and giving the state way too much power. And the fact that we do that is because all of these other states are being complicit in a certain way. So I do think that in terms of strategy, we are much more likely to apply pressure beyond UN resolutions or these pauses between the conflict that don't actually end settler colonialism at all, if we're cutting the flux of capital around it, because it's also what's reinforcing things down here. Like we have Zionist organizations and lobbies taking part into like participating directly in the Brazilian press or as consultants for things that have to do with different levels of government and movements in Brazil. So it is not just about pointing that they're there, but what are their interests in the country of maintaining that? And Lula is not revoking the cooperation agreement just because he doesn't want to irritate or he's afraid of like diplomatic retaliation. It's because it has to do with how public security and the military in Brazil are organized. And in a sense, as also a matter of exercise, if Bolsonaro was still president of Brazil, obviously we, in a domestic level, would be much worse. But I also believe that the Brazilian left would be mobilized differently around Palestine, because there are mobilizations, but they're not as massive as they could be. And if it was about like Bolsonaro is the big Zionist who's up there controlling the country and everything, and we need to revoke, we would have a lot more people from inside the left pressuring for these deals to be revoked and taking people to the streets, making the connection because our far-right government is, you know, pro-genocide, rather than what we have right now, which is sometimes us being attacked for criticizing Lula for being too weak on regarding our demands. So like the Brazilian left is a little bit of a coward right now because it's not willing to stand up and say the things that would have that the left would have said if it was with Bolsonaro, because right now, because it's under Lula, they're afraid this is going to touch on Lula's own interests as well and Lula's own performance in the government. And this is something that shows that it's really hard for certain actors in the Brazilian left when they're claiming Brazilian solidarity with Palestine to actually save face, because then we're revealing that they're safeguarding and they're like helping to protect some of these political economy interests that a progressive government is still advancing when it comes to the fact that Brazil is a colonial state too.
Thanks, Sabrina. There's a question in the chat, which I'll read. I think it's, well, I'll just read it. It says it's from Arda Ekmekji, and she asks, how can a country that practices colonialism, fascism, and apartheid be labeled by the West as the only democracy in the Middle East? Anyone can answer.
I can answer it really straightforward. Liberal propaganda, right? And that's it. In the media, in the government, it's a matter of values and how people in the West see themselves as the same values with Israel and the propaganda around it. Yeah, because if you analyze straightforward the material conditions, it's everything what you said, colonialism, apartheid,
yes,
propaganda. Yeah.
So despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, what's remarkable is how they insist on this line. Yes. Any other final? I think we're ready to, our time's up.
I have one last question. Sorry, hello,
Yes.
I'm a student. I'm also part of the CHLI program. I don't know if this might be a big question, but Sabrina, you were talking a little bit earlier about blockades, and I just wanted to maybe dig in a little bit deeper on the specific resistant tactics around boats and ports that have popped up for this most recent sort of flare up of this long history. You see, I mean, everything from the most radical being the Yemenis in the Gulf, to protesters in Oakland, California, stopping a boat the Belgian port workers also refusing to transport arms. Do you see this tactic? I mean, you mentioned a little bit about placing it in the context of a broader history, but in your estimation, is this a sort of a resurgence of an old tactic, or perhaps the evolution or development of into something new? Sort of where do you see the history of the blockade as a resistance tactic going from this specific point?
Bom dia, por aqui, tudo bem? Boa tarde, aí no Brasil.
So I think there is a resurgence. Thanks for the question. I think there's a resurgence because this reminds us of like 2010, or like the flotilla, the Freedom Flotilla, tactics around it, like disrupting trade routes and trying to push through the actual, like the siege element of it. So, but I think what's important here, and that should be what we're focusing on, is the element of labor organizing around it. So one thing is to have like Palestinian activists who organize, and like from humanitarian standpoints, or like from solidarity campaigns, and we're either going and we're blocking physically ourselves, or we're joining a sea route, like on a bunch of different boats, like there's a conversation about leaving from Turkey, so like a new Freedom Flotilla being organized right now. These convoys, they're part of the element, but they tend to be very fragile, close to actually like being able to sustain action in the long run, if we're just doing this on a campaign basis. If we're doing this from a labor organizing standpoint, then you bring two things into question here, which is like the strength of these unions. Are these sectors heavily unionized or not? Should these sectors, should we be helping to get these sectors more unionized? Make sure we involve unions in internationalism, because that was the point from the beginning. The fact that a lot of the unions throughout the world, not only we're faced with neoliberalism and precarity of labor, but we're also faced with the fact that where we still have unionized sectors, they have a tendency to become more economicist, because they're fighting austerity or privatization or attacks on their own rights, and losing some of this internationalist framework. So from the standpoint of Solidarity Palestine, building stronger internationalist ties from the unions ensure that we're not having just small pieces of performance here and there, or action that leads to a blockade for a week, but it's not sustainable, and then things get shipped either way. And then later on, that also means that by strengthening unions, we can have better questions on transition of labor in some of these sectors. Like the sector, like industrial weapons is a sector that, if we're actually planning a society for peace, is a sector that we have to degrow. It is a sector that we will have to change. So the role of the workers there, of like planning their own obsolescence and working towards transition and thinking of security in a different sense, of like anti-fascist organizing, I think is quite important. I think like one of the things that like the past years has shown us with this rise of the far right organized in government in many places, and being kicked out and then coming back, as is the case of Argentina right now, or parts of Europe, is that fascism or proto-fascism or neo-fascism, whatever term that you use, may reinvent itself as in its anti-systemic stance, or through populism, the way they reach people. But the point should have been for us to have permanent anti-fascist organizing. And this tends to be our difficulty in an internationalist left that tends to move from solidarity campaign to solidarity campaign, or from acts of denouncing something bad that happened in one place, and then next week it's somewhere else. So how we connect this through permanent action usually has to do with organizing. And I think there's potential of showing like how the call from Palestinian labor unions, so that labor unions in other parts of the world can engage in interrupting capital flow. So not just the trade of arms to Europe, but interrupting capital flows by refusing to ship to Israel I think this is quite powerful, and I think this should be combined with any more direct tactical blockade around the physical blockade of ships and ports.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sabrina. That's, I think, yes, Rima.
Yeah, I know we're out of time, but just a very last question to Greg. Actually, I've been so you show us, and it's connected to what Sabrina was also talking about now, that the history of Zionism in Palestine has been intrinsically linked to fascism from the get-go. And I was thinking whether we can wrap up with thinking about what is the future we can think about based on this history, and in that sense, is it possible for I mean, how do we and the resurgence of fascism in Europe as well is a question. How do we undo, or is it possible to undo fascism in Palestine or more globally from where we are now?
I mean, I wish I had an easy answer for you. I don't know how denazification takes place in Israel or anywhere else. It's a very difficult thing. What I would, I guess, say is, you know, I started my talk by referring to this Facebook status that's going around saying that we are stuck in Germany time. And I think it's kind of a joke, but I think it's also very, very true. Israel might get new weapons. They might have new Iron Dome defense systems and nice new cars and everything else, but it's stuck. It can't move beyond this fascist moment. I think the only future conceivable is the future of liberation. Now, that might take 100 years, that might take a week. I don't have any answers. But the only way of thinking of the future in terms of Zionism, in terms of Israel, is the liberation of Palestine. Israel's frozen, it's stuck. It's, you know, whenever these diaspora communities sometimes will freeze the values of the home country, I feel like Zionism's done that with Europe. You know, in Europe you have neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism, but in Israel it's still the good old stuff from the early 19th and late 19th and early 20th century. It's like frozen these values. And so, yeah, how do we think about the future? It's the liberation of Palestine. That's the only future that I see. Whether it comes to pass or not is another question.
Okay, thanks. I think that might be a good place to wrap things up for this evening. So thanks again to Sabrina, to Bruno, and to Greg. Thanks for giving such excellent talks, and thanks to everyone for questions and comments. And we hope you can join us for our next event, which I think is on Thursday. Which will be on Thursday, and we will send the link to everyone. So thanks again. Thank you, everyone. Thanks. Have a good evening. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.